Hi there, welcome back to the Non-Serviam podcast. I'm Lucy Steigerwald, and today there is a brand new guest in the internet studio, and that is Mikayla Novak. Welcome to Mikayla. Let me read her bio. Okay, so Mikayla Novak is a senior fellow in the FA Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. So a place familiar to libertarians of a certain type, at least. She has an economics doctorate awarded by RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia, and a sociology PhD from the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. Prior to academia in the US, Mikayla worked in the Australian Public Service as well as in think tanks. She's the author of several books, including the upcoming Routledge publication Rainbow Liberty, and has authored over 30 peer-reviewed journal articles. Her research interests include Austrian and evolutionary economics, institutional economics, public choice, and social philosophy and theory. And she has written at least one thing for our friends at the Center for a Stateless Society, which I always have to tout whenever possible. Whew, that was a prestigious and breathtaking introduction for you.
Oh, no. Well, thank you very much, Lucy. And it's a real honour to be on this podcast. And as I sort of said to you off air, and I'm very happy to say it publicly, I'm a huge fan of your work, especially your advocacy against militarism on antiwar.com. So long may those continue.
Thank you. Someday I should remember how to write again, but at least I can talk to people like you. We like to start usually with just, how would you describe your politics? Casually in a bar or an elevator or something.
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and I'm sure that's this is probably one of the sort of the central questions that we probably now ask of ourselves and to each other in modern times, don't we? And so I would say that my politics is basically libertarian politics, right? So before I left Australia to be here in the US, and I've been here now in the US for close to 4 years. I was a member of the Libertarian Party in Australia, and this was around the sort of the time of COVID, which was in effect, a highly illiberal time in the sense that sort of folks were in lockdown, and there were a whole range of sort of inhibitions of economic and sort of social freedom at that time. But that's my politics, and so then it's interesting for us to sort of think about, well, what does libertarian then mean? So I'll sort of self-describe myself this way. I'm certainly anarchy curious, no doubt about that. And so this is why I'm actually a big fan of works produced by folks like our friend Nathan Goodman, for example, Chris Coyne and Abby Hall and others who have basically, and of course yours, as we sort of said again on anti-war, with respect to problematizing the nature and the consequences of the so-called protective state, because the protective state turns out to not be so protective, does it? So certainly anarchy, sort of curious in that respect. But, I guess in my scholarship, I guess if anyone can discern a politics, I don't try to sort of ensconce politics into my scholarship at all. But, people probably take, well, there's going to be a few commitments that are associated with this, sort of libertarianism. So it's going to be basically a support for free, or as C4SS will indicate. There's a subtle distinction that's important. We could talk about it. Freed markets, very important. Limited government, constitutionally constrained if we're able to do it. If not, let's try to wither it away as best as possible. But also my commitment to liberal cosmopolitanism, tolerance, inclusion, openness. This idea that liberalism, and I guess I'm talking about this, Australians are very much like the continental Europeans. We refer to liberalism in the sort of the classic sense, right, as opposed to some sort of, I guess, a left wing co-option that seems to have occurred in the US. But nonetheless, a sort of commitment to openness, which basically suggests that liberalism or libertarianism is basically for everyone and will cater for everyone and will have benefits for everyone. I mean, that's basically my politics in a not condensed way.
Not to go further down the overly
Yep.
pedantic journey, but you are obviously Australian. Sometimes gone through life, I have to clarify, do I mean American libertarianism, European, which tends to be
Yep.
socialist-ish in other ways?
Mhm.
Kind of what's it like in Australia to be someone who calls yourself libertarian?
Yeah, so I would sort of suggest, and I'll sort of draw upon my experience of just associating with libertarians in Australia, and also just that brief time that I sort of had in the sort of the Libertarian Party, that it's pretty similar to what Americans would understand libertarianism to actually be. Now, of course, within sort of like a terminological definition of libertarianism, you're probably going to have, sort of tensions, right, between, sort of like a complete anarcho-capitalist kind of disposition versus, someone who will say, look, okay, minarchism, or sort of like a minimal state. My own scholarships, largely sort of dealt with within that domain of minarchism. There's always been that presupposition there.
Mm-hmm.
But as I've said, certainly anarchy, sort of curious, and that might be sort of reflected in part, incidentally, by some of my previous and even still current academic interest in things like blockchain
Mm-hmm.
and crypto, because these are like two nice examples that actually challenge this idea of monopolizing statist power, at least with respect to sort of finance and sort of the control of fiduciary media and all of that.
Did you have any kind of political journey from here to wherever you might have started thinking about politics in your life?
Yeah, no, that's excellent. It's a really great question. So, I don't know if it's a generalization or not, and I'd probably be risking a generalization in saying so, but I suspect that, I guess, in my teens I was probably much like my sort of peers. We were socialized in state education systems, and so you're effectively sort of taught in 1,001 sort of subtle and non-subtle ways about effectively a position of the primacy of the state. And so here, it's probably very much a kind of a statist kind of socialist, really. So I'm probably one of these many people who have actually just undertaken their own journey from that, picking up some economics, right, picking up some economics books, and in my own sort of context, and perhaps betraying my age a little bit, but that's okay. During my late teens, having sort of seen with my own eyes, at least through television and whatnot, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the
Sure.
collapse of the Soviet Empire, and obviously, in that, for any sort of person with any modicum of intelligence, that is a phenomenon that needs to be explained.
Mm-hmm.
So is that, plus at the time I started out my undergraduate studies in economics in Australia, and luckily enough, I had some excellent teachers at the University of Queensland.
Mm-hmm.
This is in Brisbane, Australia. Back in the time, it was a very it was a rather sort of, I don't think it was overall a heterodox school, but it had a healthy representation of heterodox economists. It had all sorts, really, that department. Had Marxists, had post Keynesians, had free market style people. This is something I found attractive upon the realization that, perhaps the kind of the socialism that I naively kind of supported in my teens, just isn't working out at all. So I guess, perhaps with, some gentle and, implicit sort of prompting from exposure to new ideas, I basically just self-taught myself Austrian economics and Virginia school political economy, that is public choice.
Mm-hmm.
I remember sort of picking up things like in the sort of the university library in Brisbane, Australia, all the way out there. Things like the Cato Journal and the Freeman, the foundation of free enterprise, and picking up Mises and Hayek and Buchanan, and so from there, away I went really, and at least I can sort of, at least I can say I haven't really sort of changed or altered really my basic positions, since that time. So that's kind of where the journey had kind of gotten to. So, it's like basically, a drift from, the status left. And, much later, I also incidentally sort of encountered Don Lavoie and national economic planning, and his very excellent final chapter of that book, in which, he's basically sort of saying that effectively statism is a corruption of socialist ideals anyway, and really on that point I was just sort of sold and convinced by that argument as well. So basically a drift from the naivety of kind of status socialism to the classical liberalism and libertarianism that I've kind of adopted for, my gosh, best part of 30 years really.
So, if you are indeed anarchist curious, first, kind of what is anarchism to you, and what what more do you want to know about it? What would sort of what do you feel like you're on, if you're on a fence about it or anything like that?
I think I'll sort of start off with saying, so there was a libertarian society style conference in Australia back in, well, I'm going to guess at around 2002. And so there was a prominent Australian libertarian at the time named Neville Kennard. Now, what's interesting about Neville Kennard was that he was a self made entrepreneur and business self starter. He basically set up a nationwide in Australia range of equipment storage and hire companies called Kennard Storage, and so he was a self-avowed anarchist, and so I'll start off with a description of that by just quoting from him, and that he basically, and perhaps in a reducible sense, referred to anarchy as no ruler. Okay, so but from there, you can probably then add some additional nuance to that to suggest that in anarchistic systems, at least in the way that I sort of understand and appreciate them, there's going to be effectively sort of self-rule, voluntarily among people in sort of common interaction with one another, as they basically sort of sort out the informal rules of the game of their sort of interaction, whether that be sort of economic exchanges in the form of trading, social exchanges, and things like that. So this is effectively my understanding of anarchism. So it's basically self governance and all of the myriad techniques that humankind have devised, and they indeed that they have, right. And even if you look at, and I'm very partial to a particular kind of strain of anarchism called analytical anarchism, which is sort of Peter Leeson and Edward Stringham and figures like those, who have basically have used sort of the logics of the Austrian Bloomington and Virginia schools to sort of push the boundaries of the likelihood and the feasibility of anarchism in various ways, whether that be in, let's say, self-protection or self-defense, whether that be in things like financial markets, even just sort of markets, reputational mechanisms, those kind of things. So the anarchism that I'm very prone to, at least in a sort of analytical or I guess if I'm making the distinction between positive and normative, in the positive sense is more toward that. But that's it as well. And you referred to the Center for a Stateless Society, and I've made some contributions, toward that group as well. I'm also perhaps more in a normative sense. I'm more taken with that orientation as well, to sort of think about the possibilities of anarchism and freed markets,
Hmm.
strong limitations on governments as empowerment devices for the marginalized and vulnerable in our societies. And so it's in that normative sort of strain that some of my other scholarship around, let's say, the liberal emancipation book that I edited last year, or the forthcoming Rainbow Liberty book, all of those are sort of presented with that in mind. And so, in that sense, in that normative sense, my interest in anarchism is pretty much the same as, like, as I mentioned before, my colleague Nathan Goodman, and you got other folks like Roderick Long, and you
Hmm.
got Jason Bias, and Corey Massimino, and all the other crowd that you know very well.
Hmm.
And I sort of see myself normatively in that sense, right? So, sort of thinking about not only um, anarchy as a sort of potential feasible set of arrangements for how human beings will interact and govern themselves, but actually seeing it as a normative project to actually try to eliminate the inequalities that are generated by the state.
I want to go on a little slight tangent. You said you were
Yeah.
briefly in the Libertarian Party. I guess I'm curious about your experience with that, based on some of the unfortunate inroads that certain people have made in the American Libertarian Party in the
Yeah.
last couple of years. I don't know if the Australian Libertarian Party has some
Yeah.
problems
Yeah.
with bigotry, things of that nature that we have here.
Yeah, look, I can't, to be honest with you, Lucy, I don't know if I can really speak to that. And the primary reason why I don't know if I can really speak to that in any great depth is that, I've been in the US for 4 years, almost sort of five years. And so it's not at all clear to me what kind of reactions within the Australian Libertarian Party may have unfolded, let's say, in line with
Mhm.
the ascent of Trump, or sort of Trumpian or populist illiberal politics. Now, I was sort of, I wanted to make that distinction, in that I do actually think that there is actually a genuine classical liberal or libertarian populism that exists, that is actually that intends to engage and emancipate poor, the sort of people on lower incomes, or sort of
Mhm.
those who are oppressed. Um, but I think, I mean, in a sort of in a general sense, but I don't think this will be any surprise, for me to actually say this. I mean, you'll always sort of have something of an identifiable sort of strain within libertarian politics that might emphasize, let's say, an exclusionary sort of bent in terms of, let's say, economic, but especially sort of social and
Mhm.
cultural engagement. I mean, I think you kind of see that everywhere, because to some extent, whether we might sort of speculate this is the product of misapplication, or perhaps sort of erroneous sort of thinking upon the part of those who subscribe to those things. There is a sort of a certain assumption of this idea that one given individual's rights or liberties or freedoms seems to trump those of everyone else. Whereas I'd probably take a much broader view that, look, we're not all Robinson Crusoes. Remember, Robinson Crusoe is a fictional tale, right? And it's best left at that. We're an interactive, sociable species. Adam Smith said this, and many others have actually said much the same things, including in libertarian circles. And so, we have to sort of really sort of be thinking beyond our individual selves. Yes, our individual agency and rights do matter, especially when they're trampled upon. egregiously, especially by the state and its coercive apparatus that we know as government. But then again, I mean, there's no escaping the interdependence that humankind is going to experience. So the sort of the quote unquote libertarianism. Some of it's there, but I'm just not sure if it's a really admissible or necessarily even popular or encompassing kind of modality of libertarianism that's going to bring more people to the cause, so to speak.
I guess from there, if you want to talk more about Rainbow Liberty, the full title is Rainbow Liberty: Liberal Political Economy and
Sure.
Queer Freedom, co-edited with Nathan Goodman. Can you say
Yeah.
sort of what's the back cover of the book and how it came together?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm very, very happy to talk about it, and actually very excited for its release. It's currently in a formal sort of proofing stage at the moment with the publisher, and that's coming along quite nicely. So we're sort of hoping that perhaps, who knows, around September, maybe October, it might sort of come out. But you never know with publishers; it might sort of come out a little bit later. But I can sort of speak to it from my own sort of perspective. So for the longest time, yeah, to be honest, even probably for at least 10 years, I've been wanting to um, sort of think through ways in which classical liberals and libertarians can more constructively engage with sort of issues of sort of queer freedom. And so one of the sort of the more early sort of attempts on my part to do this was the C4SS monograph on gender identity and libertarianism. So that was about 10 years ago. And so, for all that time, I've done little sort of marginal ventures here and there. I've sort of set up, blog sites which were short lived. I've appeared on other people's blog sites which were short lived and whatnot. But I've always sort of had it on the back burner. But the opportunity to be here the Mercatus Center really represented a sort of golden opportunity to formalize an academic piece of work in this space, intersecting liberalism and queer freedom, and to be able to do it with colleagues such as Nathan, as well as Jordan Lofthouse, is really just a wonderful honor for me to be able to do that, because without their sort of joint sort of efforts with them, this project would not have gotten off the ground as it is. So I can now talk a little bit about what's actually in the book. So we have a dozen chapters all up. From a wide array of sort of scholars from around the world, here in North America, continental Europe, and even more broadly, thinking about all the ways in which some of the analytical and conceptual constructs of classical liberalism or libertarianism that I've referred to earlier, which will be Austrian economics, the Bloomington School of Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom, and the Virginia School of James Buchanan Public Choice, how those tools can be applied to actually understand queer lives, to understand the sort of the opportunities and challenges that LGBTQ folks experience, not only in terms of their everyday existences, but also their sort of communal lives as well as interactions with the state. So very excited about it, yeah, and it's interesting. One of the informal responses that we had gotten to the announcement that this book will come out was from someone online who said, "Oh gosh, this is extremely overdue sort of piece of work," and indeed it is, and I think this is probably just one example of how I strategically try to engage in academic scholarship is basically to sort of search and explore and hopefully discover feasible ways and to sort of try to extend the boundaries of libertarianism and liberal thinking to areas that have just been underappreciated for whatever reason. Among from among our broad set, so to speak. So certainly, the hope and the expectation is that the Rainbow Liberty book will help fill a gap, and over time, we also hope will actually encourage some additional scholarship in the space. I mean, I think. I guess my inkling is that a lot of the sort of the queer scholarship, certainly, perhaps of a sort of a left of center kind of bent, so you'll have, representation by Marxism and sort of postmodernism and post-structuralism and critical studies. Some of these contributions, to be sure, are actually rather helpful, but I think to actually have classical liberalism and libertarianism sort of stand as equals amongst all the kind of the rival intellectual approaches to queer studies, I hope will be very helpful for people going forward, especially scholars, but also policymakers and lay people too.
How sort of, I don't know if I want to ask you to give a grade to classical liberalism and its it stands on LGBT people, because to me, like the I always generalize too much, but like American libertarianism, both there's a lot of bragging points it could do about how early it was and how tolerant and open and good it was. And at the same token, there's some corners where I don't know, people like Gary North were tolerated for fucking decades, like absurdities. So you have that, and you have the American Libertarian Party in 1972 saying marriage equality. They had a gay candidate very early, things like that. I've been living in this weird contradiction for like 2 decades now, and I don't know how if you could speak to that anymore. The sort of extremes, I guess, within libertarianism in this way.
Yeah, no, that's a good observation, and this is certainly something that my co-editors and I for this book were certainly alert and alive to. So, for example, some figures like an Ayn Rand or Murray Rothbard to some extent, they've probably said occasionally unkind things about gay folks and other folks within the LGBTQ communities. There's no doubt about that. And then we've added to that the sort of the behavioural sort of trait that we sort of previously diagnosed in respect to people adapting libertarian or classical liberal style arguments as a sort of a way to sort of exclude others in terms of sort of protecting their sort of respective rights to the exclusion of others. Certainly alert to that, but I mean, but if we sort of just if we take the sort of the bad as being a sort of totalizing representation of the sort of libertarian or classical liberal creed, then I'd worry that we'd be committing a huge mistake, because it would seem, as you've also suggested, if we think about Ralph Ryko's 1976 pamphlet on gay rights, a libertarian approach, which might have been produced actually by the Libertarian Party in the 70s. If we sort of take that as an example, we can actually see there's actually been much good in what sort of this sort of strain of thinking has actually contributed in terms of queer emancipation. So we want to sort of really sort of emphasize, and I think this is actually consistent with the classical liberal and libertarian creed. You kind of want to emphasize you're alert and alive to sort of the downsides of things, and malign and unpleasant sort of human behaviors and conduct, but you want to sort of always sort of accentuate the positive and the
Mhm.
optimistic if you can. And I actually think that by sort of embracing the sort of several conceptual and analytical themes and lessons from liberal and libertarian sort of thinking with respect to free or freed markets, limited government, and social openness. I think all of these actually provide the powerful tools that people need, including people who might sort of be losing a little bit of hope
Mhm.
in the sort of the freedom creed because of the bad apple examples. To be able to sort of push forward with a positive more positive account. One might actually just say, incidentally, as well, that some of the sort of issues that have been identified in terms of the bad apple cases. I mean, they're not limited to libertarianism or classical liberalism. I mean, you can imagine, even though I'm not a socialist. You can imagine, like, a lot of socialists will, for the purposes of sort of boundary keeping, will try to sort of identify in their own kind of cohorts who are sort of bad apples, who are reputable thinkers and whatnot. So this is just a human problem. This is not a propriety libertarianism sort of matter at hand.
No, I just when you expect a lot from them, as anyone who
Yeah.
sort of is a kid, following that ideology, I'm a harsh critic of my people. I guess is the easiest.
Yeah, no, no, no. I understand that, and I don't think you'd be necessarily engaging in a sort of a drive for purity as such. At least, I'd imagine, at least for consistency. So I completely get that, and indeed, and sort of thinking more generally about I guess the sources in which the drivers in which so we're seeing illiberalism in our time, so writ large, let's say in our politics and culture and whatnot. One might indeed say that, look, I mean, most people, regrettably, are weakly principled. That
Hmm.
that that might be actually the case, but that's no reason for us, in a normative sense, to just give up.
Hmm.
We always have to sort of be creative entrepreneurs, ideationally, logistically, practically as well, in order to sort of advance the values that we earnestly believe are going to advance the welfare of all humankind, without exception.
Back to that book, I wanted to ask about your title, your chapter titled "The Market as a Queer Social Space."
Yeah,
If you can talk a little bit more about that.
yeah. Yeah, no, be very happy to. So I'm an unabashed fan of, not just for the not for just for the fact that he is actually my superior in the Mercatus Center, but I'm an unabashed fan of Virgil Storr and his economic sociological approach to political economy. And
Hmm.
so Virgil has produced, in my estimation, a very impressive array of research that is actually articulated and illustrated the pro-social effects of markets, right? So if you're thinking about especially repeated interactions within markets, as it will so happen, not only will people have repeated opportunities to trade wares among each other, but be able to actually get to know their counterparty as a person, right, and get to know them, be able to build up sort of friendships, if not relationships, with that other person, and certainly the sort of relational sort of aspect of markets is part of that sort of thing that really makes the human world go around, right? Which is really sort of embedded or instantiated in this sort of relational kind of emphasis that we're sort of referring to here. And so Virgil Storr has, as I've said, a range of books and articles suggesting that markets are in fact inherently relational, they're pro-social, they actually support in many ways productive and healthy relationships among people. And so, with this chapter in the Rainbow Liberty book, all I'd had to do was really engage in the simple step of applying Virgil Storr's broad insights to LGBTQ interactions in markets. And so, I mean, just sort of think about it, right? If you're part of the queer community, right? I mean, what are you often doing? Not all the time, but what are you often doing? You're actually interacting with one another in commercial venues. That's one mechanism through which markets are actually undergirding sociality for queer folks, right? You engage, you can sort of transact in a whole range of LGBTQ friendly sort of stores of all kinds. We can think about the bookstores and the coffee houses, all the adult stores, all of these sort of things that the market sort of provides. Right, and that, it's actually not inimical at all to the welfare of LGBTQ people. Now, I felt that writing this kind of chapter is important because there's certainly a strain of sort of a queer, they'll call it anti-capitalism, but I mean, I'd probably interpret it as being more sort of anti-market kind of sentiment in general, which basically says things along the lines of, well, okay, markets are ubiquitous and somehow dominating, and they've basically and basically a communitarian strain of critique.
Mm-hmm.
There's also traceable within queer scholarship that says that markets have necessarily corroded LGBTQ life, and I'm trying to do in this chapter is to illustrate examples from around the world in which these critical claims, don't actually appear, at least on the surface, to hold up.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and in many cases, if you're thinking about the commercial venues, if you're thinking about the capacity of queer communities to actually use the market or leverage the market to crowdfund, to raise funds for pro queer equality projects, for example, there are actually just many open-ended ways, and even if you go back to some scholarship in the early 1970s, the British liberal journalist Samuel Brittan, in his important essay, Capitalism and the Permissive Society, he says that, look, open-ended economic entrepreneurship actually happens to cater for preferences of many people who happen to interact within the market, including minorities, and some of those preferences may be seen by a moral majority to be permissive in some sense, but nonetheless, hey presto, the market actually provides. If there's a latent want, there's going to be a supply to the extent that there's sufficient openness within these sort of economic situations. And so, in a nutshell, this is really what I'm trying to say in that chapter, that markets are indeed a queer accommodative space.
Do you think that sort of the traditional leftist or progressives, like, what could they gain from Rainbow Liberty if they happen to encounter it? What would surprise them if they're willing to check it out?
Yeah, I certainly hope that they would be willing to check it out, and we'd be happy for critiques as well, because the critiques would be posing as part of a broader conversation that we would actually hope to engage and generate. So that would certainly be good. I mean, I think from that sort of communitarian perspective, I guess there may be sort of an air of cynicism in response to everything I've just said. But I think I would just sort of reinforce the earlier point that I made, that I'm making a claim that markets aren't necessarily sort of detrimental to queer ways of living, and certainly I'll broaden it out to say that to the extent that not only economic openness is prevalent, but also social and cultural openness is prevalent. It's quite feasible for divergent members within the queer community to actually self-sort in their own situations. Interestingly, as an aside, one of the research agendas that I'm wanting to adopt in the forthcoming academic year is the further study of intentional communities or communes
Hmm.
within American society and within global societies as well. And some folks will be aware of the existence of, let's say, lesbian separatist
Yeah.
communities, or sort of LGBT communes and intentional communities as well. And I think that's consistent with the broad point that purportedly sort of liberal democratic society, right, properly understood, there's actually nothing preventing people who might actually disagree. They might sort of think that, let's say, mainstreaming of queer life, or the commercialism associated with this, somehow crass, maybe even corroding. They might sincerely believe that, and that's fine if they do. But they should also be aware, as I'm sure that they certainly are, that they can be able to self sort and self generate their own communities. If they wish to eschew, that kind of milieu,
Hmm.
right, of the so-called crass commercialism. Now, I don't think it's crass. I think it's empowering, but the critique will say that the commercialism is crass and disempowering. Well, I mean, you can basically kind of self-sort, and even sort of present. So, in addition to self-sorting in your own communities that eschew those, you can also present, to the extent that you have free speech and the right to protest and all of those sort of things. You can be able to present openly and freely the contrary view. And they certainly have, because incidentally, Lucy, the queer anti-capitalism and anti-market literature goes hot off the presses in commercial society. Now there may be sort of a hint of irony there, but I think that's just an affirmation of the point that I'm making.
Yeah, that's fair. I suppose of late, I would think that some people more than the crassness have noticed that um, so-called rainbow capitalism was a fair weather friend at best, because the immediate backpedaling once Trump rolled back in was pretty. Well, it makes one get misty eyed about the crass every company turning into a rainbow every June thing, because that was probably better than what's happening now in certain ways.
Okay, I take that as a fair observation, and I think that's actually a good one. And indeed, there's been some recent commentary in the mainstream media about how sort of pressure from governmental administration, not only in the US but elsewhere, is probably leading during Pride Month. And in other sort of similar celebrations around the world of major corporations pulling back. But isn't that actually, in part, at least in non-trivial part, actually a critique of the tightening, close entanglements between corporations and the state that actually might be critiqued from, let's say, a freed market sort of point of view? If there's sort of sufficient distance between commercial enterprise and governmental enterprise, then perhaps these sort of political pressures really sort of won't be sort of weighing perceptually sort of so heavily on corporations. And you can also probably just add to that to say that, look, yes, some of the major corporations are pulling out. That's true. There may be alternative opportunities, let's say, for mass community crowdfunding.
Mhm.
It's quite feasible to actually do that. There are actually new technologies, even sort of, crypto and things like that, where, people can actually, communities can genuinely crowdfund their own pride celebrations if they, again, sort of disagree with the, I guess, the either the crassness, or I guess some might even sort of claim to be the duplicity of sort of major corporations in terms of how they've engaged with the LGBT community. There are options.
Mhm.
One would think.
Not that I'm dying to drag you further into pessimism, but I also you sound optimistic. You're trying to escape the current vibes of so much of the world, but I did want to ask you about something that you wrote in January of this year,
Yep.
and the headline is "We're living in the fascist economy Charlotte Twight warned about."
Yep. Yep.
Um, well, that's concerning. Could you
It is.
tell me who Charlotte Twight was? Talking about something that written like 50 years ago, I believe it's.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
America's
Absolutely.
emerging fascist economy. She wrote.
Right. So you might sort of think at the surface that that particular piece, which was presented on one of the Mercatus Center's Substacks, might sort of represent a very extreme piece of pessimism. And I'll take that point, but I'll sort of try to sort of provide a sort of a counter response a little bit later. But let's introduce Charlotte Twight. So Charlotte Twight is one of these unappreciated sort of scholars in economics and political economy, whom I happen to sort of think has something very valuable to sort of say for the present times. What she did throughout her career, research career, was to basically apply the intuitions of transaction costs to politics, right? So the idea here is that there are costs associated with trying to fulfill political bargains,
Mhm,
right, within the political process. Either you're too distanced away from the decision makers, or you can't get the information that you need in the first place to be able to make appropriate sort of choices within politics. And so Charlotte Twight was basically saying that a driving force of political action, I think she's true today as she was back in 1975, is that a lot of political action surrounds trying to basically increase the transaction cost of political exchange for the ordinary person, meaning effectively that politics becomes increasingly inaccessible, right, to the ordinary person.
mhm,
Now, one of the instantiations of this, Lucy, is the rise of technocratic politics.
mhm,
Right, so you have this sort of bureaucracy, whether it be in independent statutory agencies or main headline departments, that they happen to do all the decisions, right,
mhm,
within politics. And the problem with that, of course, is that as the relative size of and scope of government increases, they have more power relative to, certainly, to the ordinary citizen voter, let alone even the legislator, right, within Congress. And so part and parcel of politics is this strategic, if not duplicitous, use of techniques, informational distortions, sort of distorting the selection of public finance instruments like taxation to make them less visible to a
mhm,
taxpayer, using regulation big time, right, to actually effectively hide the costs of bad policy everywhere
mhm,
through the economy. So it's just basically like transaction costs that affirms another scholar, Mansur Olson's sort of logic of politics being the concentration of benefits to a small group, a small elite, versus the dispersion of massive costs, actually, across the public. Charlotte Twight was using this concept of transaction costs in politics to describe all of that. And I think that her ideas, as articulated in that 1975 book, actually do carry through to today. Because, I mean, you think about thinking about, sort of the selection, let's say, tariff policy,
Hmm.
right? So, tariff policy seems to be very convenient for a politician who would want to actually distort the sort of the full costs of their public policies and to sort of try to distort the transaction costs of political exchange. Why? Despite what the Trump administration might say, the final economic incidence of tariffs, right, are borne by this very spread out American consumer, right, who can't collectively mobilize or organize to be able. We'll see in the midterms, incidentally, but not, but mind you, who typically can't organize and mobilize to express their displeasure, right, at sort of bad policies. So yeah, so pessimistic, right, in that sense, but so what there's sort of one or two things I can say in addition about it, right? The first thing I can say is that I think it's important to actually try to understand the condition of the world
Hmm.
in order to try to change it for the better. Okay, and that's where the sort of the optimistic kind of framing then comes in, because then you can start thinking about institutional reforms and governance reforms, economic reforms, liberalizations that will all have the effect of actually reducing the transaction costs of political exchange, enabling citizen voters to have a more powerful say in public affairs. And that can be a whole range of things. That can be, better transparency mechanisms for a start. That can be more effective American federalism. Now, one of the worrying sort of features of American federalism and all of the other mature federations is that there's been, over the past century, much more centralization, right? That has bankrolled, let's say, the warfare state and
Hmm.
all of those terrible things. Now, get back to genuine federalism would be another way to reduce the costs, including the transaction costs of engaging in politics and being able to get mutually satisfying exchanges in politics, assuming that we want actually that in our politics, right? So yes, on the surface, Charlotte Twight's sort of diagnosis of why government expands is pessimistic, but it's a glass half full kind of thing where you can sort of just add some sprinkles or some doses of optimism into it. Better understanding, and then from better understanding, what might be potential solutions.
I'm no economist, so it was illuminating in some ways. I guess still though, sort of what makes not transaction costs,
Yeah, transaction costs. Yeah,
sort of what makes it fascist. I mean, you wrote a little bit on the one blog about how obviously it's a loaded word that arguably was overused the past decade, but seems more relevant of late. I don't know, sort of. I guess what is
yeah. So
fascism then to you?
right, how does that sort of all relate to everything? So
Yeah.
this all relates ultimately to the growth in the scale and the scope of government, and how that growth in the scale and scope of government has actually transpired, and its peculiar and idiosyncratic instantiation in the United States. And so what we sort of have basically is increasingly a system, and forget about this sort of talk about a so-called neoliberal era from 1980 to 2007. My argument would be that the tendencies, the fascistic tendencies that Twight had talked about, had actually continued rather untrammeled during that period, especially as the regulatory state
Hmm.
has become completely enormous and such a dominating factor over our lives now. With the effect that, so she's saying that the US economy has, because of all these manipulations of the cost of political exchange, which have barred much of the public out of it to the benefit of a small elite, have led to a sort of an emergence of, not by design, but through emergence of an overall economic system where you only really have like nominal support and tolerance of commercial enterprise, but like the sword of Damocles you have hanging over your head at every turn on all occasions, the full weight of government which might bear down on you if you take, let's say, a misperceived economic turn that may be that might displease political authority. I mean, just sort of think about, for example, how governmental authorities have responded to things like cryptocurrencies and blockchain. In particular, about a decade ago, or even a little bit more now, there was this great hope that we'd see a great disintermediation of those sort of tight knit connections, let's say, between finance and the state. Well,
Mhm.
that just hasn't come about. Why? Because of just the manner, the aggressive manner in which state coercion basically unfolds within society. And it's really, in the end, it's nothing more than the policy instantiation of an infamous saying that everything in the state and nothing without it,
Yeah.
effectively. And so, people will know the sort of the dubious heritage of that kind of paraphrasing. But this is where kind of the fascism has kind of come in. So where the power of government has become so ubiquitous that it's actually very difficult for any individual to meaningfully undertake a radical, innovative agency. That's where it fits in.
You have a lot of interesting terminology that I would like people to know about. You also have a book that's called Liberal Emancipation,
Yep.
Explorations in Political and Social Economy. Can
Yep.
you maybe explain sort of the back cover of that book?
Oh, sure. So, yeah, I'm very, very happy to. So, this was a book that I edited that came out last year, which again sort of has contributions from a variety of scholars, around the world, and sort of different backgrounds, not only in economics but more broadly, thinking about emancipation as basically the quintessential normative project for liberalism and libertarianism. So, what's emancipation? So, emancipation might be simply described, although I will admit there, when you sort of start thinking into it a little bit more, there are going to be sort of shades of grey and nuances and all of that. This is like with everything, Lucy, but nonetheless, emancipation may be described as a process of freeing up people from the bonds of domination, slavery, subjection, all of this. And so we can basically, in a very sort of rough and broad way, describe emancipation as being that sort of liberal spirit that has basically emancipated people gradually, but very unevenly as well, in modern centuries, in modern times. So I see a lot of consistency between sort of what's happened until, at least until recent times, and the sort of the liberal normative spirit of emancipation, basically freeing people up to be able, not only equipping individuals with agency to go about doing things, but actually just giving each and all a basic sense of dignity and respect in basically being able to undertake their own affairs without the undue interference of other people. And that's what emancipation's all about. And so, as I've indicated, we've seen this sort of wonderful trajectory, although not fully achieved, and that's where the optimistic liberal promise is still relevant for today. But nonetheless, we've seen some awesome strides, in terms of, gender equality and racial equality, and LGBT rights, and sort of rights for other people as well, Indigenous people, although that's happened in fits and starts, I'll admit that. Also,
Mm.
migrant rights as well. All of these sort of practices and tendencies in the modern world, at least to some extent, can be attributed to classical liberal or libertarian sort of modalities of thinking. Now, it might be true that you might have some alternative adversary approaches, let's say socialism or communism or Marxism, that says, oh, we believe in emancipation as well, for example, the emancipation of workers. But as I indicated earlier, with regard to sort of Don Lavoie and his observation about the connection between socialism and the coercive state, I'd look quite askance upon, those kind of propositions. It's really in liberalism itself that you're really going to get the true achievement of emancipation in the world. Again, in practice, in fits and starts, there's much to look forward to. So I think, if anything, that we might take from the conversation, at least from my perspective, is yes, I understand the sort of the pessimism and the worry, but let's just try to shake it off constructively, not in a rose-coloured way, but in a constructive way, to try to sort of shape a freer world for everyone.
Well, that does sound pretty good. Some of the people you mentioned at the top, all of whom, I guess I've never met Roderick Long in real life, sadly. There's
Okay,
still
well, I've met
time,
him once or
hopefully.
twice. He's a good guy.
But people like Jason and Corey and Nathan,
Yeah.
maybe particularly Jason, I associate with kind of one of like some of the handful of people who seem to be able to put radicalism and what you might call liberalism together in the
Yep.
same package. And to me,
Uh-huh.
it's a very rare commodity, but I love to see it.
Yep.
I don't know kind of how you sort of make a case for liberalism and radicalism and how they can kind of work together. I guess I don't know if you consider yourself a radical after all.
Yeah, no. As I sort of indicated at the sort of outset, and I guess this was the underlying sort of premise of actually mentioning their names. Yeah, I have a lot of affinity actually for this radical sort of tilt in sort of liberalism and libertarianism. So I'm quite on board with it, to be honest with you. And this I also see as being consistent with the anarchy curious kind
Mm-hmm.
of bent in my own research as well. So let's just try to amplify these connections again in the spirit of Don Lavoie a little bit more. So on a couple of occasions already, I've mentioned that Don Lavoie was critical ultimately of the socialist project in terms of its eventual association with coercive, brutalizing statism. Now, part of his critique was not only that point, right, which is a point which is well taken,
Mm-hmm.
but the second point, which is that, it's statism, but it's boring as hell. It's conservative and
Mm-hmm.
it's boring as hell.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and so from here, I think you sort of can start imagining a genuine alternative, a radical alternative that's actually pro freedom, anti power, right? Emancipating, respectful
Mm-hmm.
of all individuals, regardless of their background circumstances. All of this, I agree, has a radicalizing character, certainly with respect and in comparison to the boring and deprivatory illiberalisms that humankind has had to suffer over these past years and decades, if not centuries.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really an optimistic path, really, to go forward, is to rekindle some of that original liberal and libertarian spirit, right, of radicalism through openness, right, through all ramparts of human life, cultural, political, economic, social, a whole lot of it, scientific, technological, right, to embrace sort of a radical openness, a tolerance for experimentation, and ultimately allowing people to just be people and let them live.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very much on board with this radical project of the other folks that you've mentioned, and I'd like to think that certainly to the extent that my own scholarship might have normative implications, even if they're presented as something of a hidden transcript, is certainly alive and well in that body of work.
Again, I like to kind of imagine if some of the work that you've done. Kind of who do you imagine to be sort of the ideal reader, and who do you what do you think the skeptical reader can get out of kind of the work that you've done? I guess more specifically, let's say, the use or even legitimacy of economics amongst, say, uh, leftists or even, sort of social anarchists, European libertarians, people who were sort of cousins, if not siblings of your beliefs.
No, that's an excellent question, and it's a very good one to ask because I actually see that the range of my own research is incredibly diverse and purposefully so. I guess, to be honest, I mean, my mind is pretty restless at the best of times, and I'm interested in so many things. And so my own research, sees nothing as necessarily as out of bounds for as long as I feel that I have something reasonably intelligent to say about it. But I'd like to sort of think that what I'm trying to do is actually just offer readers, and they can be at all levels, really. They can be, sort of, young, old, male, female, sort of policy wonks, non-policy wonks, students, lay people, whomever, really. Anyone with a sort of with an interest to potentially be able to um, cast a gaze upon the world through an alternative window. This is an analogy that James Buchanan from the Virginia School and others within Virginia political economy had often reinforced in their own teaching and research. This the ability of having a different approach that allows people to see the world in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really, I think in the end, my scholarship is just merely an invitation, for modern audiences to actually do that. And I hope that if, to the extent that folks engage with my scholarship, that it helps open their minds, or even if there's sort of criticism. I mean, I want criticism actually, because the thing is my sort of view is that ideas are not intended to be a protectorate,
Mm-hmm.
right? And incidentally, that's why I'm actually against things like intellectual property regulations and things like that, because ideas are not meant to be protectorates. Ideas, in a Popperian sense, are falsifiable as well. I could be wrong. I could be wrong about a great many things, in fact, but at least I sort of have the dare and the courage, to sort of experiment and sort of explore sort of different ideas. And I welcome the criticism, any criticism, from people from I guess, a non-liberal persuasion, because that will help me actually better learn, not only about where other people are coming from, but actually learn more, hopefully, about sort of any sort of chinks in the armor in terms of my own ideas, and think about ways to sort of improve. Liberalism and libertarianism in the end is not really meant to be some sort of static, set in stone, axiomatic set of principles. It's meant to be a living intellectual, ideological, and philosophical enterprise. It's meant to live and breathe and be relevant to the times. Yeah, and don't let's be honest. The times are a changing, Lucy. That's for
Mm-hmm.
sure. And so all in all, I just hope that the work that I've produced and will continue to produce will be receptive to a whole range of audiences, and hopefully, along several important margins, encourage discussion. That's really what we want.
And this is a bit backwards of me, but I did forget to press you a bit on sociology, and I'm
Yeah.
curious, what is it about economics and sociology that sort of go together for you, and like they inform each other, I assume.
Right. So I guess one of my first research interests, even back when I was an undergrad student, was basically in public finance, which is a species of collective action, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so this is where sociology is like directly relevant, right? Even to an economist, right? Because you're actually studying collectives and collective action, right? And so for me, sociology has always retained a relevance in that sense. But there's also, it's also quite evident as well, even if you just sort of look out the window and just observe the world, that um, individuals will tend to behave groupishly, right? There will be sort of groupish sentiments, groupish behavioral traits, and so on, which would be very important, I think, to actually study in their own right. And so you can study those from a sociological perspective, or you can study those from an economic perspective, or try to use sort of a combination of the two to understand that, for example, an economy is influenced, some might say embedded, within a broader society, but certainly it must be the case that economic action and even like the economic way of thinking is going to have some sort of influence, at least on some margins,
Right.
in broader society as well. So there's this bilateral relationship between economics and society, which led me to want to study sociology in addition to economics. And I'll just sort of make this as a side note, not because that I sought to emulate him, but Vilfredo Pareto, one of the sort of most famous economists and sociologists of the 19th and early 20th centuries, did pretty much the same thing, in that he recognized, as I did in my own life, in my own time and context, that economics can explain a great many forms of phenomena in the world, but it doesn't seem to be able to explain everything. And so for me, just like Pareto did, not to say again that I was emulating Pareto, I just did this independently, to sort of think about how it is that the broader social forces are impacting upon that human inclination to truck, barter, and exchange, as
Mhm.
Adam Smith would describe it.
We can do a little lightning round to wrap things up if you're
Sure,
game for that.
absolutely.
I guess the first thing is if you could mandate that everyone on Earth read one book, what would it be?
Oh, I don't believe in mandates. That's the problem.
That is the problem. You're right.
Maybe a friendly recommendation, huh?
Yes.
Okay, so given that sort of people, maybe are not sort of familiar with basic economic concepts, how about let's just start off with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. That way, folks can kind of understand like economics and economic policy, because one of the wonderful things that you get out of that is an understanding that economics not only gives a description of the direct effects of trades and prices and whatnot, but also the indirect effects as they sort of spread out through an economic system. Very important for understanding some of the malign consequences of policy.
Somewhere my dad is nodding with approval for that choice. I've only read parts of that, sadly. This might be an easy one, but Mises or Hayek or a secret third economist?
Secret third economist. Well, I'm going to add Buchanan.
Okay.
James Buchanan, because James Buchanan was really the first kind of classical liberal I was really introduced to back in my undergraduate, and I just lapped him all up before then going on to Mises and Hayek.
The first stop in your time machine?
I think the period around the sort of the late 1840s, around the time when the British Corn Laws were being repealed. Just want to sort of see all the energy and excitement of one of the early proto-liberal, classical liberal or libertarian social movements, the Anti-Corn Law League, and how that operated. I'm sure that Cobden and Bright, were very excellent and persuasive speakers from all accounts. That'd be cool to go back in time and see that in action.
Star Wars or Star Trek, or again, a secret third option?
I actually love both, but I do like Star Wars, and The Last Jedi I actually rate highly. That might be very, very controversial, but I like it.
All right. I'll call that one the best of a bad lot of the sequels, but
Yeah, we can do that.
the best concert you ever attended?
Oh, best concert. I've been to a lot of them. Okay, so probably in terms of just really cool and pure rock energy, I'm going to nominate the New Zealand hard rock band called Shihad,
Okay.
Shihad. So they were just a really cool hard rock band from New Zealand. Ear splitting, all of that, just very awesome in my view.
That sounds good. Your perfect meal or last meal, if I wanted to be morbid.
Perfect meal. Gosh, that's a good question. I'm probably this sounds just altogether too boring, but I just like my pastas and pizzas probably a little bit too much.
What's the most recent thing you've changed your mind about?
My gosh, yeah, that's that's actually an extremely difficult one because I guess being liking to think that one is sort of somewhat principled, it's difficult to sort of change one's mind.
It's true.
Um, Yeah, I'm almost have to sort of pass on that one. I have to sort of think about it. It's not to say that, that I'm an arrogant individual that's not open to ideas, but I need to sort of think about that one a little bit more.
That's fair. So there's probably a couple of these that I could tell people in advance, and it might be better. But
No, that's
I
okay.
do like the impromptu spirit whenever possible.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, the traditional final question is, how would I get a cappuccino in your imagined political utopia?
Well, I don't know if actually such things would exist because I don't drink them.
Mm.
So,
But how would I get it? Because I want one.
well, I don't know. It'd be up to you, wouldn't it? I don't know. I
Possibly.
don't know. Yeah, no, 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 I know what you mean, but yeah. I would defer to the experts, in other words.
The cappuccino experts.
Yeah, I'm sure there are plenty.
And I guess sort of finally to circle back to that first question, and again, not to put you on the spot, but can you give me like three additional readings, kind of that people who listen to us talk today might want to check out?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. So I can talk a little bit about some current research that I'm doing. And just a couple of books from there. So, Peter Leeson's book called Anarchy Unbound,
Mm-hmm.
and there's the subtitle is Why Self Governance Works Better Than You Think. That'd be one. Another one is by a scholar, Adam Thierry. I hope I've pronounced his surname correctly. It's called, and I'm just actually just sort of looking at my sort of bookcase here, Evasive Entrepreneurs.
Okay.
This outlines a very cool kind of idea of entrepreneurship as evasion from the regulatory state, and then I got a sort of a third one here that I'm also sort of spying. It's on top of my book heap right now, and it's a bit of a classic, but I think it actually tells us quite a lot about the times in which we live in. And this is sort of Mansur Olson's book, The Rise and Decline of Nations.
Okay.
So a somewhat controversial book at the time, but I think it's actually pretty relevant for today.
All right. Sounds good. Where on the internet can the good listeners find you?
Well, I mean, the good thing about this is that I'm extremely easily Googleable, right? So all you have to do is just type in my name in Google, and you'll find. So I've got a sort of a Google sort of page with listing of my academic scholarship that's easily traceable. Google Scholar that has a listing of my research work. Also, there will be a Mercatus Center webpage for me as well. So, as I said, very easily Googleable.
All right. That sounds good. Listeners know where to find me and Non-Serviam if you feel like following us. We're out there. But Mikayla, thanks so much for joining me today. This was a lot of fun. Makes me feel good about markets and a little bit better about the world, such as it is. And I always like that. So thank you.
Oh no, that's great. It's such an honor to be able to speak to you, Lucy. Thank you very much.
All right. You're listening to the Non-Serviam podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe over on our YouTube channel or on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us across social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Mastodon. If you're extra interested in seeing this project continue, consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com. But if you can't contribute financially, we still like you a whole lot. And you can help us out just by liking and sharing this episode or any other one that catches your fancy. As always, shout out to our existing patrons. Your support helps us reach a larger audience and helps keep this project alive. Thanks so much.